The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical song as Natalie Hayes moved through Mercy General's third-floor corridors with the kind of invisibility that comes from years of practice, from learning exactly how to occupy space without being seen, her scrubs loose enough to hide the map of scars that ran down her spine like a road no one should have to travel. She'd been a senior chief petty officer with the Special Forces in Marjah, performing field amputations under rocket fire with hands steady as surgical lasers, saving 63 Marines in a single 72-hour operation, but that person didn't exist anymore. That person lived in the lining of a Navy jacket in her locker, stitched inside a faded unit patch from the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, where no eyes could find her. Room 312 held Marcus Chen, the wheelchair-bound veteran with the vacant stare and the tattoo that made her chest tight every time she checked his vitals. His right forearm bore her name in faded ink, Senior Chief Hayes, and the date Marjah 2011 underneath it in letters that had probably cost him $200 and whatever remained of his ability to remember why he got it. Marcus had been a lance corporal under her command. She'd carried him 3 miles through Taliban fire with his left leg barely attached at the knee, her hands applying pressure while her mind calculated blood loss and survival probability, and she'd gotten him to the forward operating base at Bagram alive. His traumatic brain injury had stolen that memory clean. Now he stared past her when she adjusted his full line, his eyes passing over her like she was the equipment on the wall, and she moved on to check his medications without flinching. Pain was information. The tremor in her hands when helicopters passed overhead was just her body remembering what her mind was trying to bury. Natalie worked the shifts no one else wanted. 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. Double shifts when they called them. The night nurse who never complained, who moved with efficient precision through the dimmed corridors, who knew somehow exactly when to check on patients before they called the bell, whose hands never shook when someone flatlined. The other nurses called her reliable. Dr. Hargrove called her something else entirely, though never to her face. He watched her from the nurse's station with the kind of attention that made her skin prickle, the way a predator watches something it doesn't understand and therefore doesn't trust. He'd been a surgeon once, competent enough, but surgery required humility in front of the body's complexity. Administration required only the ability to build a hierarchy where you sat at the top. Hargrove had discovered he was very good at that second thing. The problem was that nurses requested Natalie specifically. Patients improved faster under her care. Families calmed down when she explained things in a voice that carried the weight of certainty. Hargrove would issue orders that contradicted best practice, and the nursing staff would glance at Natalie before executing them. Just once, that's all it had taken. One glance. And Hargrove had felt the invisible threads of authority slip sideways under his fingers. He didn't know she'd performed emergency cricothyrotomies in the field. He didn't know that managing a critical patient was something her body could do with the same automatic precision as breathing. He just knew that her quiet competence made his hierarchical structure feel fragile. The locker room was empty at 6:33 a.m. when she pulled open her locker door. The jacket hung there, navy blue, faded from 10 years of careful storage, the unit patch visible only if you knew where to look, stitched inside the lining where it could stay hidden while she worked her 12-hour shifts and went home to an apartment in Midtown where no one knew her name. She touched the patch once, feeling the rough embroidery under her fingertips, and closed the locker door. Her hands were steady. Her jaw was steady. The tremor that sometimes came at 3 in the morning when she lay awake thinking about the ones who didn't make it, that tremor was her own private business. Dr. Hargrove entered the unit at 7:15 a.m. with his starched white coat and his expression that suggested the building should have been cleaner just from him being in it. He nodded to the administrative staff, ignored the nurses, and positioned himself at the central station where he could see everything without having to engage with anyone beneath his authority. Natalie was updating Marcus Chen's chart, noting his vital signs, documenting that his oxygen saturation had stabilized and his pain was controlled. Her handwriting was precise. Her notations were thorough. Everything by protocol. Everything by the book. Hargrove watched her for exactly 11 seconds before turning away, his jaw tightening like he'd bitten into something bitter. The shift change occurred at 7. Day staff arrived and took over the floor. Natalie handed off her patients with the kind of clinical detail that made other nurses wish they could take notes: exact vitals, medication times, behavioral observations, family concerns, the small details that meant the difference between a patient feeling cared for and a patient feeling like a room number. She described Marcus Chen's baseline status, his medication schedule, his nutrition intake, all in a voice that carried no inflection, no emotion, just pure information transfer. One of the day nurses, Sarah, had asked once where she learned to be so thorough. Natalie had said nothing. Some questions were easier to not answer. By 7:45 a.m. she was outside in the Houston heat, where the parking lot shimmered and the air tasted like diesel exhaust and industrial bleach. Her car was a 12-year-old Honda Civic with one working air conditioning vent and a radio that only picked up either country music or news. She sat in the driver's seat for 2 minutes before starting the engine, her hand still steady, her breathing still measured. A Black Hawk helicopter passed overhead maybe 3 miles away, and her shoulders tightened involuntarily, and she waited for the tremor to pass before she drove home. The apartment was cool and dark and quiet. She made coffee at 8:15 a.m. and stood at the kitchen window watching the street below, where people moved through their ordinary lives with a kind of lightness she'd never had. Her phone buzzed. A text from the hospital: someone called in sick, could she cover the night shift? Of course she could. She always could. She texted back yes before the notification fully loaded. The next envelope she opened held her utilities bill and a letter from the VA requesting that she schedule her quarterly psychiatric intake appointment, which she'd been postponing for 4 months. Pain was information. Avoidance was also information. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was Marcus Chen's chart, which she'd never stop seeing, which would follow her through every 12-hour shift she worked at Mercy General. The fact that the man whose life she'd held together on a stretcher through miles of enemy fire now stared at her like she was a ghost, and she was okay with that, because being a ghost was easier than being remembered. Being invisible meant no one could hurt you. Being invisible meant you could help people without them owing you anything. Being invisible meant you could move through these corridors with practiced emptiness and do the job that your body was trained to do, even if your mind was still trapped in the sand and smoke of Marjah, even if your hand still felt the weight of a lance corporal bleeding out, even if the faded unit patch in your jacket lining was the only proof that you'd ever been anyone other than Natalie, the reliable night nurse who never complained and always showed up. Hargrove had no idea that the woman whose quiet competence undermined his authority had once saved an entire platoon. He had no idea that the tremor in her hands when loud noises startled her was the echo of things he couldn't possibly understand. He saw a nurse who was somehow better than she should be, and that was enough for him to begin deciding she was a problem. What he didn't see was the legend that moved through his hospital like smoke, asking for nothing, expecting nothing, giving everything to patients who would never know her real name. Dr. Hargrove cornered her at 8 in the morning outside Marcus Chen's room, his white coat still crisp, his surgical hand steady as he pointed one finger at her chest like a weapon. Rebecca Chen stood behind him, Marcus's daughter, her face already trembling before any words had been spoken. Your cavalier attitude toward hospital protocol endangers every patient in this facility, Hargrove said, loud enough for the hallway to hear, loud enough for the nurses at the station to pause their charting. Nurse Hayes, you administered pain medication 15 minutes early. 15 minutes. That is not a margin of error. That is insubordination. His voice didn't raise. It didn't need to. The precision of his contempt was far more cutting than volume. Perhaps in whatever community clinic you worked before, such sloppiness was acceptable. But at Mercy General we maintained standards. Real standards. Natalie felt Rebecca's eyes on her, searching for some sign that this wasn't true, that the nurse who'd held her father's hand through 3 nights of panic wasn't the careless, dangerous person being described in this hallway. Marcus sat in his wheelchair 12 feet away, his face blank, his confused eyes staring at nothing. One measured breath. That was all she allowed herself. She wiped away the single tear that escaped without breaking eye contact with Hargrove, her jaw clenching for exactly 1 second before releasing. I documented every decision in the chart, Doctor, she said quietly, her voice steady as a surgical laser. Which I notice you haven't actually read. Rebecca's mouth opened slightly. Hargrove's face darkened. He leaned closer, and Natalie didn't step back. "You will address me with the respect my position demands," he whispered. "You are nothing here. Less than nothing." She said nothing else. Turned and walked past him down the corridor, past the cluster of nurses pretending they hadn't been listening, past the open charts and the beeping monitors and the fluorescent lights that suddenly felt too bright, too exposing. Behind her, she heard Rebecca's voice. "Dad, is she really?" And then Hargrove's response, smooth and poisonous. "She's a problem, Rebecca. We're handling it." By noon, the formal write-up appeared on the unit board in the break room, a crisp white paper with her name printed in bold letters. Pattern of insubordination. Protocol violations. Failure to maintain professional standards. Hargrove's signature at the bottom, the letters pressed so hard into the paper they nearly tore through. The accusations were specific enough to sound authoritative, vague enough to be impossible to disprove. Natalie read it once, then turned away. The break room went silent. Every pair of eyes tracked her movement like she'd just walked in carrying something contagious. At 12:30, when she entered the break room with her brown paper lunch bag, the 6 nurses at the main table stood simultaneously. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in a cascading wave like dominoes falling in slow motion. Sarah Chen, the young nurse from night shift who'd smiled at her yesterday, started to speak. "Natalie, I don't think," another nurse grabbed her arm, pulled her toward the corner by the sink. The remaining nurses scattered like Natalie had announced an active fire, leaving half-eaten sandwiches and cooling coffee behind, creating a perimeter of empty space around the chair where she stood. She sat down at the empty table, the brown bag making a small sound as it landed on the plastic surface. Unwrapped her sandwich with hands that didn't shake because they couldn't afford to shake, because shaking meant breaking, and she'd learned 37 years ago in Kandahar that breaking meant dying. The lettuce was wilted. She ate it anyway. Tears fell silently onto the plastic wrap, but her hands remained steady, her jaw forward, her eyes fixed on the window overlooking the parking lot where rain had started to fall like applause. Sarah Chen watched from across the room, trapped between what she knew and what she'd been shown. The other nurses didn't make eye contact with her either. The silence in the break room was the kind of silence that occurs after someone has been executed in a public square, the silence of people who'd seen something they couldn't unsee, a hierarchy enforced so brutally and so completely that even kindness became dangerous. When Natalie finished eating, she placed her plastic wrap neatly in the trash, rinsed her hands at the sink while everyone avoided her, and returned to her floor. But the message had been delivered in that silence. She was untouchable. Not because she'd done something admirable, but because she'd done something unforgivable. She'd demonstrated competence in front of a man who required constant validation that his competence was absolute and supreme. At 3 in the afternoon, Dr. Hargrove summoned her to the hallway outside the ICU. He was already there when she arrived, his phone in his hand, his expression carrying the satisfied weight of someone who'd just concluded a successful execution. "Your services are being reviewed, nurse," he said quietly, his voice smooth as oil. "I've contacted your VA references and 2 board members. I've documented a pattern of dangerous behavior. By Friday, you'll be gone. And this unit will remember you as a cautionary tale about nurses who forget their place." He smiled then. A small smile, private and possessive. "You understand what I've done, don't you? You understand that I own you now?" Natalie took one measured breath. The hallway stretched around them, sterile and white, fluorescent lights casting everything in the color of bleached bone. She felt the weight of the jacket in her locker, 17 floors down, the unit patch still hidden in its lining where she'd sewn it years ago, the last physical remnant of who she'd actually been before she'd learned to disappear. One tear escaped. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact. When she spoke, her voice came out low and level, a voice that had commanded field trauma units in the dark. "I faced worse men than you in worse places than this, Doctor." He stepped back. Not because of what she'd said, but because of how she'd said it, the shift in her voice, the way the temperature of the hallway seemed to drop 5 degrees. It was only a second. Then his face hardened again, and he turned away, phone already at his ear. Thompson? It's Hargrove. We have a situation. A dangerous, unstable nurse who's now making threats. I need immediate action. He walked toward the stairwell, his voice fading. No, I can't wait until Friday. This needs to happen today. She's a liability. The hallway went back to normal. The monitors beeped. The ventilators wheezed. The hospital continued, and Natalie Hayes stood alone in the white corridor, her hands at her sides, her composure intact, her mask perfectly in place. But what happened next would change everything. The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a man in a uniform who required her signature. Natalie signed without reading the return address, though she already knew. The envelope was thick, official, hospital embossed. Inside, suspension effective immediately, pending investigation into medication protocol violations, do not enter Mercy General facilities until further notice, a hearing would be scheduled. The words blurred together like watercolor in rain. She sat on her apartment steps in the Houston heat, the unsealed envelope hanging from her fingers. 48 hours. That's how long it had taken. From Hargrove's hallway ambush to the certified mail, 48 hours for the institutional machinery to grind forward and erase her from the roster. The afternoon sun beat down on the concrete, and she didn't move. A neighbor passed by, nodded awkwardly, walked faster. She was already becoming invisible again, the way she'd learned in Marjah, how to disappear inside your own skin. Inside the apartment, the quiet was a different kind of weapon. No hospital sounds. No ventilators, no monitor alarms, no page systems crackling overhead. Just the hum of the air conditioning unit working against the Texas heat. Natalie pulled off her shoes and sat on the worn couch where nothing had changed in 3 years. Same lamp. Same coffee table with a book she'd never finished. Same life, except now it had a hole in it. The PTSD didn't announce itself. It crept. First came the hyperfocus, her hands remembering the feel of a crash cart, her ears tuned to frequencies only she could hear. Then the physical symptoms, jaw clenched so tight her teeth ached, shoulders rigid as body armor, her breath coming shallow and controlled, the way it had come in collapsed buildings when breathing loud could get you killed. She stood and walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water she didn't drink, set it on the counter untouched. The apartment felt too small. The walls felt closer than they should. Her phone sat on the kitchen table. She could call her therapist at the VA. Could call the union rep, could call someone. Instead she opened her laptop and stared at her personnel file, the one the hospital had sent weeks ago as part of her onboarding. Natalie Hayes, RN, BSN, 3 years at Mercy General, spotless record, 23 commendations, 0 complaints prior to Dr. Hargrove's arrival. 5 years at Veterans Affairs before that. Nothing before that. Nothing on paper. Nothing that mattered. She closed the laptop. At 6:15 on Wednesday evening, Natalie stood in the lobby of Mercy General holding an empty cardboard box. The box was one of the hospital's. She'd grabbed it from the storage closet months ago when she'd reorganized the supply room during a night shift. It was the kind of box that held reams of printer paper, 500 sheets of blank white paper, the kind of box that could hold an entire professional life. She'd folded it small and kept it in her truck bed for reasons she couldn't articulate. Sometimes you carried things for months before you knew why. The elevator door slid open with a hydraulic sigh. She stepped inside. The air smelled like antiseptic and something else, the metallic tang of fear sweat from someone's urgent morning, traces of it still hanging in the metal chamber. The elevator climbed. For floors. 20 seconds. She could have walked the stairs in faster time, but she didn't. She rode with the box folded in her hands, not breathing, not thinking, occupying the space her body required and nothing more. The 4th floor opened onto the nursing corridor. To her left, the supply closet where she'd grabbed the box. To her right, the long hallway that led to the lockers, the break room, the nurse's station where she'd spent 1,000 shifts. Ahead, past all of that, the cardiac wing. She turned toward the lockers, walking the corridor with the singular focus of someone moving through hostile territory, counting steps the way she'd counted steps in Marjah: 1 foot, 2 foot, 3 foot, 4. She didn't hear the code blue alarm so much as feel it, the way she'd learned to feel incoming fire, a vibration in her sternum before her ears processed the sound. The alarm screamed from the speaker system overhead, that particular frequency designed to cut through conversation and concentrate every trained nerve in the building. Code blue, cardiac wing. The announcement came next, clinical and urgent. Code blue, room for 47, cardiac wing. Crash cart to room for 47. All available personnel. Natalie's feet stopped moving before her mind caught up. The cardboard box shifted in her hands. From where she stood, she could see down the corridor toward the cardiac wing, maybe 150 feet of distance, and she could see the movement, nurses running, someone shouting, the controlled chaos of a hospital in crisis. She was suspended. She was not authorized to be in this building, let alone in a code. She started walking toward the sound. The voices grew louder as she moved. A nurse, cardiac tamponade, massive fluid buildup. Another, somebody page cardiology. A third, higher-pitched, ETA 12 minutes for cards. Patients crashing now. She could hear the monitor in the distance, that particular tone that meant the heart had stopped beating in an organized way, had begun the electrical chaos of fibrillation. The sound of a patient dying. Room for 47 had its door already thrown open. The crash cart stood abandoned outside in the hallway like a metal skeleton, its drawers hanging open, supplies scattered. Natalie could see through the window of the door into the room itself, and what she saw froze the breath in her chest for one deliberate second. Dr. Hargrove stood at the patient's bedside in full PPE, a gown, gloves, mask, and his hands were shaking. Not trembling. Shaking. The kind of shake that comes from a man trying to hold precision he doesn't possess while his nervous system screams that something is wrong. In his right hand, he held a pericardiocentesis needle, the kind designed to pierce the chest wall and drain fluid from the pericardium, the sac surrounding the heart. In his left hand, he held nothing. His confidence had evaporated. The patient on the bed was grey-blue, the color of someone whose oxygen saturation had dropped past 60, whose organs were beginning the shutdown sequence. Two nurses stood on either side, one manually bagging oxygen into lungs, the other calling out vitals with the tone of someone watching seconds count down toward death. The monitor above the bed showed a rhythm that was trying to organize itself, failing, trying again, the electrical signature of a heart drowning in its own fluid. Somebody page cardiology, one of the nurses repeated, though cardiology had already been paged, though cardiology would arrive too late. Natalie's hand moved to the door handle before she thought. Her body had made a decision that her brain was still processing. 36 hours of suspension. 36 hours of her career being erased, of Hargrove's calls to board members, of becoming a liability. 36 hours of knowing that if she walked into that room, if she violated her suspended status, she would give Hargrove the ammunition he needed to make sure she never worked in Houston again. The patient's monitor flatlined. She pushed the door open. "You're suspended, get out." Hargrove's voice was shrill, the voice of a man whose world was suddenly structured very differently than he'd assumed. His authority was melting like ice in July, and he could feel it. The needle in his hand wavered. Natalie didn't answer him. She didn't explain, didn't apologize, didn't ask permission. She simply moved toward him with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd performed this exact procedure in an exploded building while mortar rounds impacted the concrete outside, and she reached for the needle with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. Hargrove released it without fighting, his hands falling away, and she repositioned him gently but firmly, moving him aside the way you move furniture out of a room, not unkindly, but without negotiation. The correct angle for pericardiocentesis was the fifth intercostal space, parasternal, the needle angled toward the heart at 45 degrees. Her hands found this angle without consultation with her brain. The skin was cold and wet with prep solution, the ribs underneath were solid anchors. She inserted the needle with the kind of precision that comes from muscle memory, from 1,000 practice procedures, from 407 combat operations in Helmand province. The needle slid past skin, past fascia, and then she felt the change in resistance as the point penetrated the pericardium itself. The hiss of air escaping. Bloody fluid, dark as motor oil, began draining into the collection syringe. 20 milliliters. 30. The pressure around the patient's heart released, the constriction easing, the physical compression that had been killing them breath by breath releasing its grip. 40 milliliters. The monitor began to reorganize itself, the electrical chaos finding rhythm again. 45 milliliters. The patient's color began to change, oxygen saturation climbing from 62 to 70 to 80, the red slowly returning to gray cheeks. She withdrew the needle with the same precision she'd inserted it, applied pressure, and stepped back. The syringe in her hand held 47 milliliters of blood and serous fluid, the fluid that had been slowly strangling the patient's heart. Beside the bed, the monitor showed a rhythm that was no longer chaotic. Sinus rhythm. The heart was beating again. The room went so quiet she could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead, that soft electronic buzz that most people never noticed. The nurse with the oxygen bag stared at her. Hargrove stared at her. The other nurse, the one calling vitals, cleared his throat and spoke, SATS R94. BP 105/68. Heart rate steady at 88. The patient was alive because of what she'd just done. The patient would keep being alive because of what she'd just done. Hargrove's face moved through a series of expressions the way clouds pass across the sun, shock first, then something like relief, then a kind of calculation that was worse than anger. His eyes narrowed. He looked at her the way a scientist looks at a problem that hasn't yet been solved, the way a chess player looks at a board where someone has made an unexpected move. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. Get out, he said quietly. Effective immediately. Get out of this hospital. The crash cart sat abandoned outside room for 47 like a toppled sculpture, its defibrillator pads scattered across the tile. Natalie's feet stopped moving before her conscious mind caught up. Her shoulders tensed. Muscle memory, the kind that came from 4 tours watching chaos unfold in milliseconds, recognized the empty stretcher, the open drug box, the absence of bodies moving with purpose. Someone was dying in there. Someone was dying while doctors stood frozen. She pushed through the double doors. The cardiac monitoring system screamed its flatline song into the clinical silence. Dr. Hargrove stood at the patient's bedside with a pericardiocentesis needle trembling in his right hand like a tuning fork struck too hard. His jaw clenched. His breath came in shallow pulls. The needle hovered above the patient's chest at the wrong angle, too shallow, no entry vector, and Hargrove's eyes had that particular glaze of someone watching themselves fail from outside their own body. The attending physician who'd constructed entire hierarchies of authority to prove his superiority now couldn't execute the single procedure that would drain the blood strangling the heart. 40 seconds. The patient had 40 seconds at this cardiac output. Step back, Natalie said. Not a question. Not even a request. The voice came from somewhere deeper than her throat, somewhere that remembered the weight of 214 Marines depending on hands that didn't hesitate. Hargrove turned. His mouth opened. In that fractional pause, maybe 1 second, Natalie moved past him, palmed the needle from his grip, palpated the 5th intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, felt the anatomical landmark sing under her fingertips like a song her body had never forgotten. The needle went in. Not gentle. Efficient. Her shoulder, the one that still woke her at 3 a.m. with phantom pain from the shattered acromion she'd shattered carrying Marcus Chen 3 miles through Taliban fire, moved with the precision of someone who'd done this 17 times while mortars walked closer. The hiss of air escaping. That's all it took. The patient's oxygen saturation climbed. 68 to 72 to 81 to 89. The monitor went from flatline shriek to something almost like rhythm. The tension in the chest cavity released like a pressure valve in her own body, and Natalie stepped back with the needle secured, the tamponade drained, the patient breathing in something that resembled survival. 41 seconds. She'd taken 41 seconds. The room held its collective breath. No one moved. A young resident's hand froze midway to his mouth. A nurse standing near the 4 pumps stopped blinking. Hargrove's face cycled through red to white to a shade somewhere between contempt and recognition he couldn't afford to feel. "Call cardiothoracic," Natalie said to no one in particular. To everyone. Her voice carried the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Tell them we need a balloon pump. Now." She turned and walked out. Behind her, the monitor beeped its steadying rhythm, each pulse an indictment, a proof, a problem that needed solving in ways Hargrove's credentials couldn't manage. But that wasn't the worst part. By 1 p.m., 2 things had become clear: the patient would live, and Natalie would burn for it. Hospital security appeared in the corridor at 1:51 p.m. Not the guards who knew her, who'd nodded respectfully when she'd worked nights. Different uniforms. Different orders. They carried themselves with the rigid politeness of people executing instructions they'd memorized but didn't understand. "Ms. Hayes, you need to come with us," the senior officer said. His name tag read Robertson. His eyes didn't meet hers. The conference room on the 4th floor occupied the corner with the best view of Houston's skyline, 37 stories up, glass walls on 2 sides, the kind of space where authority felt heavier because the exits were farther away. Martin Cross, the hospital president, sat at the head of a table that looked like polished obsidian. 2 investigators flanked him, both wearing the detached expressions of people who'd already decided the verdict before the trial began. Hargrove occupied the seat closest to Cross, and his tie had been re-knotted, his hair combed, his entire appearance reset to the version of himself that hospitals trusted. "Miss Hayes," Cross said, not looking up from the prepared statement in front of him. His voice carried the smoothness of a man who'd never been interrupted and didn't plan to start now. "Please sit." Natalie remained standing. The jacket in the cardboard box, the one she'd carried from the ER, rested against her leg where the security officers had taken it from her locker. Her stethoscope hung across the back of a chair like a noose waiting for someone else's neck. At approximately 12:43 p.m., one of the investigators began, a woman with gray-streaked hair and the efficiency of someone who'd done this before. "You entered a sterile cardiac care environment while under active suspension from clinical duties. You physically took a medical instrument from attending physician Dr. Hargrove. You performed a medical procedure without authorization, licensure for this specific environment, or supervisory approval." "The patient coded," Natalie said. 5 words. Not a defense. Not an excuse. A statement of fact. "The patient coded," the male investigator echoed, as if he'd known she would say this and had already prepared his counter. "And per hospital protocol, the responsibility for medical intervention falls to the attending physician, not to suspended nursing staff. What you performed, regardless of outcome, constitutes the unauthorized practice of medicine. It violates your suspension terms. It exposes this hospital to liability." Hargrove's face bore the expression of a man watching someone he decided was incompetent suddenly save a life through sheer competence. The contradiction should have bothered him. Instead, it seemed to have crystallized something in his bearing, not shame, but the particular fury that comes from losing control of a narrative. "Dr. Hargrove has documented," the woman continued, "that you approached him aggressively, that you took the needle without permission, and that you performed the procedure while openly defying hospital policy. These actions demonstrate instability, disregard for chain of command, and a pattern of insubordination that began with the medication protocol incident 3 days prior." "The patient lives," Natalie said. Still standing. Still steady. Her hands hung at her sides, not clenched, not trembling. Just hands that had held lives together and now held nothing. "Miss Hayes," Cross finally looked at her, and his eyes held the particular coldness of a man who'd played 18 holes of golf with Hargrove the previous Saturday. "Your heroics, if we can call them that, have created an impossible situation. You were suspended from clinical duties. You re-entered a clinical space. You took action without authorization. That you saved a patient's life is irrelevant to the fact that you violated your suspension conditions. In hospitals, policy exists to maintain order. You've compromised that order. The patient is not your patient, Hargrove interrupted, his voice carrying a knife's edge. Not any longer. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. A nurse's monitor beeped somewhere distant in the hospital. An elevator dinged. The fluorescent panel above them buzzed with the particular hum of institutional infrastructure, a sound so constant that humans stopped hearing it until the moment their employment ended. Effective immediately, Cross said, placing his pen down with deliberate care, your employment at Mercy General is terminated for cause. You will receive no severance, no final paycheck, and no written reference. We will be reporting this incident to the Texas Board of Nursing and the State Medical Licensing Authority. Security will escort you from the building. Any personal items from your locker have been collected and will be provided to you upon exit. The room didn't spin. That would have been a mercy. Instead, everything stayed perfectly still while Natalie's mind fragmented into pieces like she was watching this happen to someone else, watching herself walk toward the exit, watching the investigators already shuffling papers, already moving on to the next case, the next suspended employee, the next violation of protocol that would become a story at the morning staff meeting. At the ER exit, security handed her the cardboard box. Her stethoscope lay on top, the earpieces curled like they were waiting to listen to a heartbeat again. Her extra scrubs were folded beneath it. And underneath those, the navy jacket. She pulled it out. The fabric had faded to the color of old denim, the sleeves slightly stiff from 4 years of hanging in a hospital locker. On the inside, just above the left pocket, someone had sewn a patch once. The Special Forces insignia. She'd done it herself in 2011 after Marjah, after realizing she could never take it off but could never show it either. The same guard who'd nodded to her for 3 years met her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. "I'm sorry, Miss Hayes," he said, and she believed him. "I'm sorry." She walked through the lobby past nurses who suddenly needed to check charts, past patients who stared because they recognized something in her face even if they couldn't name it. At Marcus's room, she paused. Rebecca sat in the visitor's chair reading something aloud, a magazine article about weather systems, something normal, something that didn't require Marcus to remember anything he'd forgotten. He stared at the wall. His tattoo, her name, still dark against his forearm. She didn't go in. The parking garage held the particular echo of spaces designed for vehicles, not for women holding cardboard boxes containing the evidence of their professional cremation. Her car sat where she'd parked it this morning, an eternity ago. She sat in the driver's seat with the door open, box on the passenger side, stethoscope catching light that filtered down from the level above. The jacket lay on top like a flag over a coffin. She'd come back to Mercy General to demand her final paycheck. Now she'd left with a box instead. At 10 p.m., the Houston VA hospital's waiting room held the particular fluorescent brightness that erased the distinction between day and night. She sat in a plastic chair among amputees scrolling through phones, a man with a prosthetic leg doing physical therapy exercises, veterans who still moved like they were waiting for orders. Her box sat beside her. She raised her hand to the intake desk, and when the woman behind the counter looked up, Natalie said the word she'd been running from for 4 years. "I need psychiatric help," she said. "I'm a veteran. I can't do this alone anymore." The woman nodded like she'd heard this before, like she would hear it again, like the words were the admission price to a club no one wanted to join. Natalie filled out forms. Admitted her rank that she'd hidden for so long it felt like lying to speak it aloud. Checked boxes about sleep, about hypervigilance, about dreams where rockets were singing her name. A young Marine with prosthetic legs from the knees down glanced over, recognizing something in her posture, in the way her shoulders carried weight that had nothing to do with the cardboard box. "What branch?" he asked. She looked at him and couldn't answer. Just shook her head. The tears came then, there in the VA waiting room among veterans she'd once treated as their combat medic, finally admitting what she'd spent for years denying, she'd never stopped being a patient herself. 48 hours after her termination, the ER doors at Mercy General slid open with the pneumatic hiss of compressed air, and Natalie Hayes walked through them carrying nothing but the documentation she'd need to claim her final paycheck from Human Resources. The HR office sat in the administrative wing, 3 floors up, past the cafeteria where she'd eaten alone for the last 4 years, past the break room where nurses had stopped speaking when she entered. She'd rehearsed the words, polite, professional, brief. Get the paperwork. Get the check. Never come back. The elevator doors were closing when the ER intercom crackled to life, a voice she didn't recognize calling for trauma bay activation. Construction accident. Male, 63, moderate to severe abdominal trauma from a forklift collision. She'd turned away from the closing doors, muscle memory stronger than resignation letters, and descended back to the ground floor before she'd even made a conscious decision to do so. The trauma bay smelled like antiseptic and fresh blood and something else, the acrid metallic tang that came when an open wound met oxygen. Nurses moved with practiced efficiency, cutting away clothing, setting up monitors, the ventilator already in place on a crash cart. Natalie stood in the periphery, not in scrubs anymore, just in her street clothes, her hospital badge sitting in a drawer at home beside her discharge papers. She wasn't supposed to be here. She wasn't supposed to work here. She wasn't supposed to. The patient's head turned slightly, and his eyes locked directly onto hers. Everything inside her went absolutely still. The man's face was weathered dark, scarred across one cheekbone, his eyes carrying the particular hardness that came from living through decades of conflict. He opened his mouth and began screaming in Pashto, the words rising in pitch and fury, his body convulsing against the restraints. The nurses around him exchanged confused glances. Trauma patients sometimes vocalized pain, but this was different. This was recognition. This was rage. The American Devil woman, he shrieked, his accent thick and brutal. The one who killed my brother. Outside Marjah. Marjah. Natalie's hand moved to her jacket pocket automatically, a gesture from another lifetime, and found nothing. She'd turned to walk away when a voice, young and trembling, cut through the chaos. That's her. A teenager stood at the edge of the trauma bay, maybe 17, wearing a volunteer's ID badge. His face was pale as hospital lighting, his hands shaking as he held a leather-bound journal. He stepped forward with the unsteady movement of someone walking through water, and when he spoke again, his voice cracked into pieces. Your Senior Chief Petty Officer Hayes. It wasn't a question. The room went so quiet you could hear the cardiac monitor's persistent electronic pulse. Nurses paused mid-motion. The attending physician, Dr. Sarah Castellano, not Hargrove, thank God, turned to look at Natalie with sudden interest, suddenly seeing something different in the woman standing in street clothes in the corner of her trauma bay. The teenager opened the journal. His hands shook so badly that the pages fluttered. When he spoke, he read slowly, translating as he went, his voice carrying the weight of words written long ago in another language. November 2008. Outside Marjah. The medic moved through fire without hesitation. Her hands moved like prayer. She was not prayer, she was action. She saved the young one with the bleeding in his chest. She saved the specialist with the shattered leg. She moved between 3 different platoons, 50 meters of open ground, rockets coming down like rain, and she moved through it like the air itself protected her. She saved 60 of them. 60. We counted the names. The families in the village asked who she was, and we told them, Senior Chief Petty Officer. American Devil. Guardian. The boy's voice broke completely. My father says she should have been his enemy. Instead, she was his deliverance. The father on the trauma table stopped screaming. Natalie felt her jaw clench, once, hard, and then release. The mask she'd been wearing since walking through the ER doors was still intact, still perfect, still empty. The ER doors burst open again, and a man in civilian clothes entered with the confidence of someone who'd never needed a hospital badge to belong anywhere. He wore his age like a uniform, close-cropped silver hair, forearms corded with 20 years of rope work, a presence that made the air pressure change. Retired Commander Marcus Morrison, SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon. Behind him came two more men in dark suits who moved like federal agents because they were federal agents, their badges already visible on their belts. Morrison's eyes found Natalie across the trauma bay, and something in his face shifted, recognition, and then a kind of profound sadness that came from understanding sacrifice that no ceremony could ever properly honor. Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes, he said, his voice like a tank idling in a garage, steady and inexorable. Bronze Star for Valor Under Fire, 2006. Silver Star for the Helmand Province Operation, 2007. Another Silver Star for the Mass Casualty Response, 2008. 2 Purple Hearts from 2 separate IED detonations. And a Navy Cross. He let that last one sit in the silence like an artillery shell that hadn't detonated yet. A Navy Cross. For actions during Operation Marjah. For treating 67 Marines under sustained fire. For refusing evacuation when wounded. For walking back into impact zones for times after already being told to stand down. Morrison stepped forward, and the nurses parted without being asked. That's not just hero work, Senior Chief. That's the kind of thing that gets people named in classified briefings. Dr. Hargrove had entered the trauma bay sometime during Morrison's recitation, drawn by the commotion, by the presence of authority that couldn't be ignored. Now he stood frozen, his face draining of color in real time, the blood withdrawing from his features like water draining from a sink. Natalie could see the exact moment he understood. The exact moment he realized that the woman he'd fired 48 hours earlier for violating medication protocols, the woman he'd called reckless, incompetent, a liability, had carried more authority in her stethoscope than he'd accumulated in his entire career. One of the federal agents, a woman with gray eyes and the bearing of someone who'd spent years making people very nervous, turned to the elder Afghan man on the trauma table. "Your son," she said quietly, "is right. This woman saved lives in places most of us will never understand. She's a decorated combat medic. And her testimony is going to be extremely valuable in matters of national security." She paused, letting that sink in, then added with casual precision, "Senior Chief Hayes has federal protection status. Anything that happens to her, any retaliation of any kind, becomes a federal matter within 72 hours. The message wasn't subtle. The message was meant to travel through the hospital like electricity through copper wire. Dr. Castellano had already turned back to her trauma patient, already switched into full professional mode, understanding somehow without being told that the ER was no longer the place where this reckoning would occur. Hargrove was backing toward the exit when a security guard appeared, the same one who'd handed Natalie her cardboard box 48 hours earlier, the same one whose name she'd never learned, the same one who'd looked genuinely sorry when he'd placed her stethoscope inside the box beside her scrubs and the jacket with the hidden patch. He carried another cardboard box, identical to the one from 2 days ago. He approached Dr. Hargrove with the measured steps of someone delivering bad news with professional dignity. "I believe you know the way out, Doctor," he said quietly. Within 4 hours, the hospital board had convened an emergency session. Security footage from the ER showed everything: Hargrove's hands shaking during patient assessment, his paralysis, his incompetence. Then it showed Natalie Hayes performing a pericardiocentesis with the precision of someone operating on automatic muscle memory, saving a patient that Hargrove had already decided to let die. Within 8 hours, the board had reviewed her termination documents. They'd read Hargrove's characterization of her actions: reckless, dangerous, a violation of suspension protocols, a liability to patient safety. Then they'd heard from Morrison about Navy crosses. Then they'd heard from the federal agents about classified operations. Then they'd heard from nurses, one after another, describing the pattern: Hargrove's retaliation against anyone who questioned him, his particular viciousness toward Natalie, his methodical destruction of her reputation. By 6 p.m., Hospital President Martin Cross sat across from Dr. Hargrove in a closed conference room and spoke words that ended careers. "Your employment is terminated, effective immediately. Your medical privileges are suspended pending state board review. You'll receive a separation agreement that requires you to waive all severance in exchange for us not pursuing legal action for fraud and misrepresentation. Your characterization of Senior Chief Hayes as reckless was false. Your failure to disclose her military service during termination proceedings violates federal employment law. And your deliberate retaliation against her has created liability this hospital cannot survive. By that evening, the story had broken on local news. Decorated war hero fired for saving patient, hospital board investigates administrator. Hargrove's phone filled with messages from colleagues suddenly unable to have lunch, from professional organizations requesting his immediate resignation, from the state medical board opening a formal inquiry into his conduct. 6 months later, Natalie Hayes walked through the new Veteran Services wing at Mercy General, and it was hers. Every part of it. The trauma-informed protocols designed specifically for providers who understood military medicine and PTSD and the particular way that combat wounds sometimes lived in the nervous system. The 50 veterans she saw weekly, the group therapy sessions, the outreach partnerships with the VA. The program she'd designed from scratch, named after the Marines she'd treated in Marjah. On her office wall hung her jacket, properly displayed now in a frame, the faded patch finally visible for everyone to see. Beside it hung her formal military portrait and her decorations. Bronze Star. Silver Star. Silver Star again. 2 Purple Hearts. Navy Cross. The medals hung beneath glass like artifacts in a museum, except Natalie came into the office every morning and looked at them and still couldn't quite believe they belonged to her. Marcus Chen arrived for his weekly appointment at 2 p.m. on a Thursday, his wheelchair gliding smoothly across the polished floor. His daughter Rebecca followed behind. She was interning in the program now, learning how to build community resources for veterans' families. When Marcus looked at Natalie, really looked at her, focusing on her face with the intensity of someone trying to remember something precious, his eyes went wet. "Senior Chief," he said. His voice was almost reverent. "Your Senior Chief Petty Officer Hayes." Natalie nodded, and something tight in her chest loosened, just slightly. "I remember your name," he whispered. "My tattoo finally matches the woman I'm looking at." Today was the day the braces fit properly. Today was the day his physical therapist had cleared him for standing. Today was the day Natalie would hold his hands while he stood from the wheelchair for the first time in 3 years, his legs still weak, his balance still fragile, but his will absolute. She pressed her hands into his, and he pushed upward with the kind of determination that came from understanding what you were fighting for. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3 steps. His legs trembled like a newborn foal, like machinery trying to remember its purpose, and then he was back in the chair, both of them breathing hard, both of them crying. Rebecca captured the entire moment on video. Across the city, at Houston Community College, Dr. Hargrove taught CPR certification to students who paid $75 for a 4-hour class and never asked questions about why he wasn't practicing medicine anymore. His salary had dropped by 70%. His professional reputation was in ruins. Case studies in medical ethics used his actions as an example of administrative abuse and retaliation against decorated service members. The state medical board had restricted his license to education only, no clinical practice, no patient contact, no possibility of ever holding authority again. That same security guard had walked into his office holding an identical cardboard box, said identical words, and closed an identical door on an identical ending. Sarah Chen, Natalie's second-in-command, brought afternoon coffee and mentioned that Johns Hopkins wanted to consult on Natalie's model. Then Massachusetts General. Then Walter Reed Military Medical Center. The program was spreading, becoming a template, becoming standard practice. Retired Commander Morrison sent monthly updates about other missing medics they'd located through the publicity about Natalie's story, 7 so far, all of them now connected with the program, all of them finally honored for work that had lived in shadow. On Natalie's desk sat a photograph from a formal Navy ceremony last month. She stood in full dress uniform, medals precisely arranged on her chest, her senior chief's insignia visible on her sleeve. Beside her, supported by new leg braces and the steady pressure of her hand, stood Marcus Chen. He'd insisted on attending. He'd stood for the photo. 3 months ago, he'd been paralyzed. 3 months ago, she'd been unemployed, destroyed, invisible. The world had simply caught up to what was already true. Natalie closed her office door and stood alone in the quiet, letting the weight of the past 6 months settle onto her shoulders. Pain was information. Silence had been strategy. And sometimes the bravest warriors carried stethoscopes, not guns. Hit that like button if you appreciate the nurses and healthcare workers in your life. Drop a comment if you've ever worked in medicine or know someone who has. Subscribe and let's see what happens next.